Hey, man, you guys should all sign up for the Libertarian Institute's email list. Will Porter's been putting together this great newsletter every week. And all you got to do is go to the bottom of the page at libertarianinstitute.org and sign up there. It's real dang good. All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and the brand new Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I've recorded more than 5,500 interviews since 2003, almost all on foreign policy, and all available for you at scotthorton.org. You can sign up for the podcast feed there, and the full interview archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, on the line, I got Tim Shorrock, and, he's a hell of a great journalist. He wrote the book Spies for Hire, The Secret World of Intelligence Outsourcing, and he's a real expert on Korea, writes for The Nation, and things like that. And he's got a brand new project called The Shorrock Files, and it's at patreon.com. Welcome back to the show, Tim. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
It's been a little while.
It's been a while.
You're in my book.
I got your book, yeah?
Yeah, Hotter Than the Sun. Did I send you one?
You did, yes.
Okay, good. Sorry, I got what Biden's got. I can remember everything I read, but I can't remember anything else. Listen. So, and it's a really good interview, too. It's a great summary of kind of an end cap on what Trump tried and failed to do with North Korea there. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, but it's one really great reason for people to buy and read Hotter Than the Sun, Time to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Tim Shorrock's great takes. But so tell us all about this new project, the Shorrock Files, Tim.
Well, first of all, I'm trying to do like so many other people who've gone on Substack. I looked at that and decided with the combination of reporting I've done and all the archives I have, I thought doing a Patreon would be better because I could do kind of a multimedia presentation of my work. And so that's what I've done. So it's a Patreon where people can subscribe for as little as $3 a month, cheap. But the basic price is $5 a month. And then it's linked to my website, which I've redesigned to be an archive of my work and research I've been doing on U.S. involvement in South Korea and Japan and East Asia in general, basically, since the 1970s. And so I've got archives that, on one hand, I became famous in Korea for disclosing the kind of hidden U.S. role in the 1980 citizen uprising in South Korea against a military coup, where the Carter administration basically sided with the military dictators and helped them put down a uprising in this city. And I've got a ton of documents about that are now they've been available, but now they're searchable, and I'm increasing that archive, and I'm also been working on another book about the U.S. and Korea and Japan since 1945, and as I've been doing the research for that, I'm going to be posting all kinds of documentation and documents and photographs and other kinds of media about the U.S. role in Asia since the end of World War II. And it's also got all my reporting on intelligence and the privatization of intelligence going way back. And so it's a real resource, I think, for people that are interested in American policy in Asia, one of the most important parts of the world, and where we're, of course, the situation there is very dangerous right now. At least this morning, I watched, Biden after his meeting with Xi Jinping in Indonesia. So at least the U.S. is talking to Xi Jinping, but all negotiations with North Korea have ended. They've been over since the talks with Trump and Kim Jong-un collapsed in 2019.
Mm-hmm.
So, I hope to be a resource for people really, interested in following these developments and trying to understand that, when we talk about confronting China militarily, that it means, all the confrontation will come from all these U.S. bases that are in South Korea and Japan and Okinawa, Guam. And this is a massive military empire that itself, I think is a real danger to peace. And I think, that's what I hope to bring attention to with this Patreon, which is called DMZ Empire. People can go to it by just going to Patreon/DMZ Empire. And the reason I call it a DMZ Empire is that I see the U.S. Force structure in Asia, based of 28,500 troops in South Korea, about 50,000 in Japan and Okinawa, mostly in Okinawa, and of course the forces in Guam. That military empire is based on the permanent division of South Korea and the kind of the merger of South Korea with Japan, and in terms of the U.S. military. And in the last couple of days, the Biden administration has been putting out all these statements and tweets and policy overviews of what they're doing, all based on what they call this trilateral military relationship with South Korea and Japan, which I believe is at the heart of a lot of the military confrontation. And actually, that is a problem in and of itself. And that's what I'm trying to bring attention to.
Yeah. So that's such an important point, that they've created this permanent greater and greater disincentive for ever negotiating any kind of real peace with North Korea, because that opens the door to reunification. And that opens the question of South Korea armed with North Korea's nuclear weapons and not having to do what we say anymore. And so that'll screw up your whole trilateral thing you're doing there, right?
Right. And of course, now, I mean, Japan has been under, the rule of the Liberal Democratic Party, the ruling party, since basically they've been ruling almost uninterrupted since 1955. And this, of course, is a very pro-American, very subservient to U.S. interests kind of government. South Korea, until recently, has gone, well, it's gone back and forth between progressive governments and very conservative governments since the 1990s. As your listeners know, and you've had me on the program when talks were actually going on between North and South Korea and the U.S. and North Korea. That was under Moon Jae-in, who was the president of South Korea from 2007 until recently. And he was very progressive and wanted engagement with North Korea. And he actually, initiated negotiations. And this was back in 2008. And out of that negotiation grew the invitation from North Korea to meet with President Trump when he was president. And, out of that grew, there was great hope that there would be a peaceful resolution to what the U.S. considers, the problematic is the development of nuclear weapons in North Korea. And, these negotiations went pretty far, but, in 2019, they collapsed because, Kim Jong-un and North Korea came forward with this proposal where they would close about 80% of their nuclear facilities. It's basically this one big place where they make their weapons. This site called Yongbyon they were willing to close that down, but they wanted in return a lifting of some of the latest sanctions that were imposed on North Korea by the U.S. and the United Nations Security Council. But the Trump and Pompeo and the people around him did not want to give up any sanctions until they had fully denuclearized. And so the talks collapsed. And now, and since then, a very conservative president was narrowly elected in South Korea earlier this year, and President Yoon, and he is very militaristic himself. He has threatened to have preemptive strikes on North Korea, and he's very much in tune with the Biden administration's hawkishness on North Korea, and so as a result, this kind of three-way trilateral alliance with Japan and South Korea under this conservative president in South Korea is really developing rapidly. And of course, particularly over the last few months, North Korea has been testing a record number of missiles. And some of them are shorter range and some of them are long range missiles, but they've really developed this capacity basically to hit any U.S. base in the area. So that means, U.S. bases they've targeted U.S. bases in Japan, Okinawa, South Korea, Guam. And of course, the U.S. has this massive military structure arrayed against them. And so the situation is deteriorating, and it's dangerous on both sides. And I'm really concerned about what could happen as a result.
All right. Well, we all know that the ruiner of all good things is George W. Bush, and that 20 years ago was 2002, and that 2002 was the year of many great, terrible things, including right around this time in 2002 was when, as I remember it, John Bolton at the State Department, of course, under the supervision of Bush and Cheney, broke the agreed framework deal of 1994, announced new sanctions, put North Korea in announced what they called the PSI, the Proliferation Security Initiative, which was their declared right to seize whatever North Korean ships on the high seas that they felt like. And then they added them to the Nuclear Posture Review in December. And that was the final straw.
And of course, that came Bush put North Korea on the axis of evil.
Oh, yeah, that was at the beginning of the year, yeah. Right. Yeah, that is important. I always skip that, right? I always go to the fall. But yeah, the axis of evil thing is important. That here, I mean, and look at the absolute absurdity of this. But don't let it fool you, people. Like if you were too young to remember, this was important. I mean, people took this seriously. That there was an alliance, an axis, like Hitler and Mussolini and Tojo, an axis between Saddam Hussein, the Ayatollah, Kim Jong-il, and Osama bin Laden. Mm-hmm.
That's what they tried to make people think.
But then it wasn't until I think the last straw, and let me know if I left out anything else. That was that series of that's 5-6 provocations of 2002 was what finally led to Kim Jong-il announcing he was withdrawing from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, kicking the IAEA inspectors out of the country. And only then did he start making nuclear weapons, and not out of enriched uranium from a hidden uranium enrichment program based on Pakistani aluminum tubes and all that, like in John Bolton's lies, but instead on plutonium harvested from their Soviet era Yongbyon reactor, the one you already mentioned there. And now they have, a couple of dozen nukes, and it's all John Bolton and George W. Bush's fault.
Well, if we can go back, I mean, the Clinton agreement that you referred to that was actually North Korea, that was signed in 94, as you said. And it was called the Agreed Framework. And it was a first step toward, actually, in the minds of the U.S. negotiators and the North Korean negotiators, it was the first step toward, ending the state of war and hostility between the U.S. and North Korea, and normalizing relationships, normalizing diplomatic relations eventually.
I mean, that's even the name of it, right? It's the Agreed Framework. It's like, let's get started on
right.
improving things. All right, now tell me about Newt Gingrich.
Right, and so then you had, this agreement. North Korea froze its nuclear program under the agreement with Clinton, under this agreed framework, and actually for 12 years there was no fissile, material made. They didn't make any kind of nuclear, weapons grade material that could be used in bombs. So it was shut down for a total of 12 years, and then in the end of the 90s, at the very end of the Clinton administration, there was negotiations to end North Korea's missile program. They came very close to an agreement, and it was pretty much signed off on by both leaders in both countries at the end of the Clinton administration. And then, Bush came in, and immediately within a few months of his administration, before 9/11, Bush had met with the then Korean president and the great hero of the opposition movement, Kim Dae-jung, who was the president at that time in 2001. And he was the one who had initiated the initial engagement with North Korea. And he was the first president of South Korea to meet with the North Korean leaders. And Bush said, we don't trust North Korea, we're not going to negotiate anymore, and basically ended that period of engagement. And then, as you mentioned, the next year in 2002, Bush sent a delegation to Pyongyang, and they said, you're building a uranium facility, and therefore you violated the agreement. Therefore, we're pulling out, and therefore there's no agreement. But in fact, what had happened at that time was that North Korea was, bringing in parts that could be made into a uranium enrichment site. They had not enriched any uranium yet, though, and they said they were willing to talk about it and willing to negotiate it, but they felt that they had a right to do that as sort of a backup in case this agreement fell apart. Because it came under intense Republican opposition as soon as the Republicans came in 94, after they signed this. And so then, the U.S. Bush accused them of, building this uranium facility and trying to build a uranium bomb, and they just ended the whole framework. And so after a couple of years, North Korea did not explode a nuclear bomb until after Bush canceled all the engagement. In 2006 was their first bomb.
Right. Yeah. No, it took them 3 years or something to make one. 3 or 4 years.
It took them 3 years. And so then, and they've developed it ever since. And then, of course, when these negotiations happened in 2018 that I mentioned, and then Trump met with him.
Let me just interrupt here to note real quick that we know for a fact on at least 95% of these tests that they've done that these are plutonium bombs. These are not enriched uranium bombs. They can tell from the radioactive signatures and whatever all the scientists can. So there's no question that this all came from plutonium harvested from their reactor that we already knew they had, that they had turned off under the agreement, that our side breaking the agreement led them to turn back on.
Right. And so now the situation has also changed now, because back when there was negotiations in 2018, 2019, when North Korea was slapped with sanctions by the UN Security Council in 2017 and 2018, both China and Russia voted for those sanctions. because they themselves felt that North Korea's nuclear program was a problem, and they recognized, they felt that their ICBM tests were also broke international agreements. And so the Russians and the Chinese voted for the sanctions. But of course, now we're almost at war with Russia, and we're very hostile toward China. And so they're no longer willing to go along with sanctions against North Korea. So, North Korea has sort of taken advantage of that and is testing its missile capability.
Right.
But the U.S. has been saying incessantly since, I've traced this back to last May 5th of this year. Biden's national security advisor said, North Korea is ready to test another bomb any moment now, and the press, repeated that, and they say this every day. They said it again today, but since May 8th, there's been no nuclear test, but they keep saying there's going to be one, and so we have to be prepared. And so each side is just ratcheting up, so then the North Korean does these tests, and then the U.S. does these massive air exercises with both South Korea and Japan, and they keep doing these military exercises that are designed to completely destroy, North Korea. If there was any kind of conflict, any kind of armed conflict. And they've been going back to the rhetoric, the Pentagon anyway, has been going back to the rhetoric that Trump was using in 2017, i.e., you will be totally destroyed if you continue this path.
They sent Kamala Harris over there to threaten them.
It just had American policy has just simply not, under Biden, the hostility, nothing has changed. They say, we're open to talks, but they won't come forward with any kind of negotiating, any kind of plan that would move the two sides, towards reconciliation.
Right. Now, so stop there for a second, and not to personalize this too much, but hey, everybody knows and hates John Bolton, and it is his fault, and it's easier for people to understand it in this way, right? That and you alluded to this a bit, that but I want to make this clear, and you can correct me wherever I get it screwed up here, Tim, but just my best understanding of the narrative here is, once Bush pushed North Korea to nukes, he said, well, now you have to give up your nukes or I'll never talk to you again. I remember him famously getting in an argument with President Roh of South Korea over a mistranslation. Roh goes, did you just say we could negotiate first and then like nukes later? And Bush goes, no, I did not say that. When? Yeah, okay. Then Barack Obama comes in. He's emperor for 8 years. He keeps the exact same policy. They call it strategic patience, which just means ignoring North Korea as I guess better than constantly ratcheting up tensions, but mostly ignoring them, trying to outsource negotiating with them to China for whatever good that would do, but insisting on the Bush formulation that once they give up their nukes, then we'll start talking to them, which of course is the poisonous pill in the whole world, is meant to fail, is meant to prevent negotiations from happening. Then Trump comes and the South Korean president says, and you're right, because I do remember that, they did in 2008, Bush softened for a minute and then took it back. That is an important kind of side note there. But then under Trump, the South Korean president comes and says, look, man, I want to make a deal. We'll put nukes on the back burner for a minute and see if we can just make a deal with them. And this is about after a year of Trump playing Mr. Tough Guy, Fire and Fury and all that. And then Trump says, fine, go ahead. And he has the South Korean delegation go ahead and announce it in the White House driveway before his own government can stop him. And but then there's one guy from the actual government, I guess, Stephen Began, and he gives a speech at Heritage and says, all right, look, we're putting nukes on the back burner. We're going to make peace with North Korea on all these different issues, and or we're going to allow the South Koreans to and cooperate with that. And then we'll get to nukes, we'll trade some security guarantees, this and that. And then So I remember, I think, interviewing you at the time and saying, this is the greatest invention in the history of diplomacy with North Korea in the last 75 years or something like that, is this formulation by Began. Then they go to, correct me, I forget if it was in Saigon or if it was when they were in
Hanoi.
Singapore. I'm sorry?
Hanoi.
Singapore was first. Okay.
Yeah, Singapore was first, right?
And they bring John Bolton, and Began has to sit in the back of the room, and Bolton sits at the table and blusters and threatens and prevents any progress from being made, and then that's all she wrote.
Well, at Singapore, they did make a declaration which, as you said, basically put denuclearization as kind of a second step. And the initial language was, to improve the relationship and end the hostility. That was basically the point of what they said. And then
so that's what led to the DMZ photos and all of that, right? So then what happened?
But then when they went, then when they were, they had, and then they set this meeting in March 2019 in Hanoi, and Kim Jong-un took a train all the way from Pyongyang down to Hanoi. Spent all 2 or 3 day train trip, and then they sat down, and it looked like it was right before Hanoi that Began made that speech where Began said basically, we're trying to have a breakthrough that will put make the peace first, and then go next to dealing with this nuclearization issue. But that was, he was speaking out of school, basically. That was not accepted by either Trump or Pompeo, and especially by Bolton. And so when Kim Jong-un came there and laid out this, offer to shut down Yongbyon in return for not lifting all sanctions, but lifting the most recent sanctions, which had really stifled the North Korean economy, and particularly the civilian economy, because it basically, stopped all imports and exports, and even of essential goods. And so that really had put the screws on North Korea and its economy. But that deal was, they just rejected it. Trump rejected it, and Bolton played the big role there. And Bolton has said since, that would have been a terrible mistake. And, Bolton was a big force in that breakdown of that agreement. And he also, talked very disparagingly about the president of South Korea at the time, Moon, very disrespectful, basically, not recognize them as equals or anything. Just, basically you're just this colony of ours and you have to go along with whatever we say. And, but, even before the agreements fell apart, North and South, Kim Jong-un and Moon had made a lot of progress in bilateral negotiations. They had really, brought tensions down on the border to DMZ by removing mines and making changes there, so it wasn't such a confrontational situation on the border. And they had also wanted to, have some economic exchanges, and there was one big project that they wanted to do, which was for the South Koreans to help the North Koreans modernize their railroads. But that was vetoed by the Pentagon in the U.S. Because the Pentagon runs the so-called UN command in Korea, which controls any border crossings, any crossing of the border between North and South. And so when South Korea, wanted to bring people north to work on the railroad project, that was just flatly denied by the U.S. and the Pentagon. And so, that also played into it, because like the North Koreans finally started saying, well, here you are, South Korea, saying you want to make the peace and, and make, help with our economy and make it less tense because of that. But you can't do it because Uncle Sam won't let you. So it really underscored their fears that South Korea was so much under the control of the U.S. And they've been saying that a lot lately.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, hang on just one second. Hey guys, anybody who signs up to listen to this show by way of Patreon will be invited to join the Reddit group. And I'm going to start posting stuff over there more. That's patreon.com/Scott Horton Show. Thanks. Hey y'all, libertasbella.com is where you get Scott Horton Show and Libertarian Institute shirts, sweatshirts, mugs, and stickers and things, including the great Top Lobsters designs as well. See, that way it says on your shirt why you're so smart. Libertas Bella, from the same great folks who bring you ammo.com for all your ammunition needs too. That's libertasbella.com. You guys check it out. This is so cool. The great Mike Swanson's new book is finally out. He's been working on this thing for years. And I admit I haven't read it yet. I'm going to get to it as soon as I can, but I know you guys are going to want to beat me to it. It's called Why the Vietnam War: Nuclear Bombs and Nation Building in Southeast Asia, 1945 through 61. And as he explains on the back here, all of our popular culture and our retellings and our history and our movies are all about the height of the American war there in, say, 1964 through 1974. But how did we get there? Why is this all Harry Truman's fault? Find out in Why the Vietnam War by the great Mike Swanson. Available now. So back to where we started, right? This is because the U.S. government does not want peace. They prefer nuclear brinksmanship on the Korean Peninsula so they can keep South Korea and Japan under their thumb as a united front against China.
And they want to have this, they've had this massive military infrastructure since, since after the Korean War. I mean, it's been, one of the important things about the nuclear story that I don't think gets enough attention is the fact that, it was the United States that first introduced nuclear weapons into Korea. First by, during the Korean War, both President Truman and President Eisenhower threatened North Korea with nuclear attacks if they wouldn't sign, the agreement, that the armistice. And they made those threats numerous times. And then in 1957 and 1958, the U.S. actually introduced nuclear weapons into South Korea. They brought in hundreds of tactical nuclear weapons. Some were on planes, some were in cannons. And then there was even some, American soldiers would carry them on their backpacks. These sort of miniature nukes that they, send a missile from these small backpacks. And so, they introduced nuclear weapons early on in the 50s. It wasn't until 30 years later that North Korea began developing its own nuclear program. And, I think that's a development that is completely ignored in U.S., coverage of Korea. Like, we're the ones who brought in nuclear weapons. In 1991, George H.W. Bush removed those tactical weapons from Korea and a number of other places around the world as part of a broader kind of campaign, broader program dealing with the Soviet Union and arms control. And that was a good thing that they did that. But the U.S., of course, has nuclear weapons in the region, on its aircraft carriers, on submarines, on all, planes that fly from Guam, these big, strategic bombers that the U.S. has. So, there's still like a real nuclear threat. And of course, they say South Korea is under the so-called nuclear umbrella. What does that mean? Well, that means, if there's a war, the U.S. would use nuclear weapons. And so we're basically back to, back to the old confrontation, except now, China and Russia, are not willing to, vote against North Korea in the UN Security Council anymore. And of course, all the latest, American policy formulations coming out of the Pentagon makes, the big enemy is now China, and China knows that very well. And as I've been saying, if Biden can meet with Xi Jinping, who's supposed to be our big enemy, Why can't he meet with Kim Jong-un? I mean, Biden admitted this morning on the press conference that he did from Indonesia that he said, well, I don't think we can really say that China controls North Korea. Well, duh, China cannot control North Korea. China does not have military forces in North Korea. China has a good relationship with them, but they don't control them. The only way you're going to get any kind of movement is by having direct negotiations. And it's insane that it's been 77 years, and there's only been one period of like 18 months when the top leaders of the US met with the top leaders of North Korea. And I think you're right. The refusal to negotiate anything besides, you have to give up all your nuclear weapons and then we'll talk about other things. That's not the way to make the peace.
Oh, and they know that too.
They
That's
know
their
that.
most poison pill. It's the most blatant thing in the world. You'd think they'd come up with another way to sabotage it and try to pretend to be the nice guy for a minute. Liberal, rules-based world order and all of that crap. But nope. This is purely, Hillary Clinton's muscular foreign policy.
Right. It hasn't changed at all. And, the thing is, like a lot of the people that made, you were talking about this Obama policy of, basically benign neglect, right? But it was during that time Obama was working very hard to, cement the military alliance between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. And Tony Blinken, the current Secretary of State, and his current national security advisor, they were key parts of that Obama policy administration. I mean, Blinken was his deputy national security advisor. So they played very important roles under Obama, and they're back doing the same thing now. And I think it's just a really dangerous situation, in that if it continues, I think we need to start listening to the people of South Korea. There's been many groups in civil society groups in South Korea. 700 groups put an incredible statement together about 2 weeks ago, calling on both North Korea and the U.S. and South Korea to stop escalating, to stop the cycle of escalation where North Korea tests and then the U.S., and South Korea have these massive exercises, and where they fly, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of fighter planes, and that just raises the tensions all over. And so South Koreans are saying, let's stop this escalation and get back, to negotiating an end to the Korean War. And they say, get back to the declaration that the U.S. and North Korea made in Singapore, the Singapore Declaration. Use that as a beginning language. And also in 1992, South Korea and North Korea had this very broad agreement on, having no nuclear weapons in their country, period. But that's where the negotiations began between North and South Korea. So they're saying, let's stop the escalation and begin talking to, so lots of American analysts are now saying, just recognize North Korea as a nuclear power, and then, try to negotiate arms control. I think that's a good starting point. But I think we have to end the war, the state of war. The Korean War never ended. It's just an armistice. There was never a peace agreement. The U.S. torpedoed any peace agreement. And there was 1954. There was talks that were supposed to, end and bring a peace agreement. But the U.S. torpedoed them. The U.S. had no interest in a peace agreement in Korea because they wanted to maintain South Korea as a massive military base, which they did from the Korean War on. South Korea was this military garrison. And, we can't forget that it was under a military garrison state under incredibly authoritarian rule. it was a torture state, until the late 1980s. So the U.S. has a huge responsibility for what happened. The U.S. policy from the 50s, 60s, and 70s of military confrontation, kept it at a state of, like you say, like that. And then that's, what the military industrial complex likes. They want to have this state of war. They can say we have to have more weapons and more of this and more rockets and, more strategic planes and et cetera. And it just keeps going and going. It just doesn't seem to change.
Yeah, well, hey, did you see the news that they're going to debut the new long-range stealth bomber? I'm not sure if that has anything to do with what we're talking about here.
Well, then they could fly from Nebraska or wherever those planes are based all the way to North Korea. And, it's just
they cost $1 billion each. It's great.
Oh, great. Yeah, terrific. That's all we need, right?
Mm-hmm. And it is a matter of the flea wagging the dog and so many of these things, right? I mean, you mentioned Harry Truman, how this never went away since him. But, really since FDR built this war machine to fight World War II. And I can't remember who it was. Oh, I'm such an idiot. Someone was just characterizing this wonderfully the other day about how big business in America really did not want to get into World War II. So instead of coercing them, FDR just made him a deal. Look, stop making things that people want and start making weapons of death and destruction, and I'll pay you handsomely with deficit spending. And they were like, word. And then they never stopped. That was it. They never stopped ever since then. And I'm like, what are you going to do? I mean,
Eisenhower was right about the military industrial complex. Too bad he said it just as he was leaving office. But
yeah,
it's, it's out of control. And you see, they're the ones who really influence policy. I've been writing about this for years, right? Center for Strategic International Studies. Who are they? They're funded by Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and everybody else. And all these think tanks that are funded by these huge military contractors. They're not interested in peace. But that's who the press quotes all the time in the U.S.
Yep. I remember as a little kid probably listening to like National Public Radio or something in the 80s and hearing them talk about a think tank. Oh, that's interesting. Because you picture a tank, right? Like a little kid, you're like, picture a think tank. What do they? Well, they sit there and think about things. But the definition of that from the ground up always when people teach their little kids should be that it's corruption. It's the worst thing about America. It's where arms dealers pay corrupt academics exorbitant amounts of tax money that they stole in order to write justifications for the money they make killing innocent people. That's who they are. They're the worst people in the whole world.
These militarists. I mean, it's just American militarism is a scourge on the planet. It's this past, this history, this hidden history that is it's so hard to get to. That's the reason for I'm doing this Patreon. That's the reason I have this website up, is so people can understand this history more. And I'm trying to use it to so people can read about what happened earlier in the 70s and the 80s and so on, and read about the U.S. support for military governments in South Korea for so long, and their support for reactionary Cold War ruling party in Japan. That was, the LDP was created by the CIA. Millions and millions of dollars went to Japan in the 1950s to support, its pro-U.S. government that's been in power, and that's why I'm doing this. Is that we need to understand the past and break away from this militarism story and that whole way of looking at things, and look at what we've done, and then try to go from there and try to understand why we're at why the situation is so tense right now. You have to go back and understand it.
And by the way,
so that's what I do, and I hope people go to it. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope they will too. We're gonna plug that real good at the end too. But it kind of goes without saying, so it does go unsaid. I don't know if you and I have ever even really discussed this in all these years. Is the tyranny of North Korea? Everybody knows it is like the world's last Stalinist stronghold, right? And I read something about something like 2/3 of the people in North Korea are in the military, something like that. Like is the most.
It's very, very militaristic. The military itself has enormous amount of power there, and yes, it's a totalitarian state, a totalitarian garrison state, but they've been feeling with some justification since the Korean War that they're under great threat from the United States, and I think South Korea, until the late 80s was also a draconian authoritarian state.
Mhm.
I called it was a torture state. People stood up. It wasn't the United States that gave democracy to South Korea. People stood up and fought for years against this U.S.-backed military government in South Korea, and finally, broke its back with public protests. Year after year, month after month. That took a lot of organizing, but for many years it was under this kind of authoritarian state. The U.S. got really used to having an authoritarian state, and that would just do what the United States wanted it to do.
Well, and also
And
look, I mean, the point there's a couple points there too about, I mean, not to downplay the South, but just to change the subject back to the North there, is one, people get very emotionally invested in these narratives. So they need to understand, and we need to make it blatant probably for people, that none of this is an apology for the government of North Korea. We're just pointing the finger at our own government and what it's doing wrong, which is plenty. And you know what I mean? You don't have to be on the side of David Koresh or Manuel Noriega or Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi or any of these people in order to just tell the truth about the situation. It's as
nobody
simple as that.
deserves.
And also, wait, the second point, and you can go ahead right after this, is that just because somebody runs a tyranny doesn't mean that they are externally adventurous and pose a threat to their neighbors necessarily. Now, when provoked and they have total, dictatorship type power, it's pretty hard for checks and balances to stop them from reacting in terrible ways. But you could believe every absolute horrible thing about David Koresh. Still doesn't mean he's about to march on downtown Waco. Same thing here. And people conflate these things. Oh, Chairman Xi, he's evil. Well, he is the dictator of a communist dictatorship. What the hell can I say? That's pretty much the definition of evil, other than straight from hell or something like that. But does that mean that he's about to occupy Japan? No. And so we got to be able to, parse these issues. And I think that as totalitarian as the North Korean state is, they respond to incentives just like everybody else. And here, America is the 8 trillion ton gorilla. We have everything to give and nothing to lose by just treating them like a little kid, patronize them a little bit, but be nice enough to warm things up. And we should be able to do that. That's all we're saying here.
Confrontation just makes the human rights problem situation in North Korea worse, because as the South Korean government did for years, the North Korean government, of course, uses the external threat as the justification for this massive police state that they have. And I think it's there's example after example around the world when you make the peace, cruelty within your system dissipates, and cruelty and violence dissipate when you make the peace, and that country does not feel threatened. Look what happened in Ireland. There are years of confrontation, and IRA versus the British government, and there was terrible violence on both sides. Right? When they finally reached the peace, there wasn't. The IRA didn't set off bombs in downtown London anymore. I mean, it ended, right? It wasn't because the Irish were just insane and cruel by themselves. They wanted to get free of the UK, They wanted to get free of it, British control. And so, like, you make the peace. They finally made the peace, and the violence ended. And terrorism ended between the two sides. And I think the same thing could happen in Korea. But you have to end this war. It's so important, and that's what a lot of South Koreans, who of course are concerned about the rights of the people across the border. They're their family. They're their uncles, grandparents. Families are split. People don't want to see those people all killed in a war. They don't want to see them persecuted either. But the way to do it is to bring some kind of peace to the land, so the two sides can develop, the relationship on their own, as they've shown they can do, as happened under the last administration of Moon Jae-in. There was a real breakthrough between North and South, and unfortunately, the U.S. military posture really destroyed that movement, I think, and. That's the thing, is that it's not that they're all evil on one side. It's just that they make terrible decisions because they're under this wartime situation, and they fear being attacked, and so they fear an internal, they fear any kind of internal threat to them. That's also a threat. So. End the war. I think that's what lots of peace activists in South Korea have been saying for years and years and years. We got to bring a formal end to the Korean War, which could eventually mean U.S. forces would leave, and that's something I think the Pentagon and the military establishment here does not want to do. They don't want to decrease American bases there. They want to keep them.
Yeah. 70 years on just a ceasefire and no peace treaty. That's just incredible.
It's really sad. It's really sad.
American diplomacy. And hey, that's one where we said fine and called it a stalemate. That could have been a lot worse, man. Anyway, let's not do the whole Korean War now. The last one.
Well, the one thing I want to say is that, I think it's going to take some outside force. I mean, the thing is, the UN does not have any credibility in Korea because it's the UN. They gave command of U.S. to the UN command, right? So, like, an independent country that's not tied to either side. I'm thinking like maybe Brazil.
Yeah, somebody has no dog in the fight at all, right?
Yeah, and they have relationships with North Korea. They have diplomatic relationships with North Korea. Why not have Lula try to sit down with the three sides?
I mean, and this is what's so ridiculous, right? Is that this is supposed to be America's role in the world. Right. We don't have a dog in any of these fights, but we'll host your peace conference. Yeah. But no. We're the evil empire now. So
I mean, we should have been, trying to negotiate an end to this war in Ukraine months and months and months ago. Yeah, instead of arming them to the hilt and keeping the war going, we're just fueling that war. It's not. There's no statesman-like action. Like, okay, let's stop the fighting and let's meet in some third country and let's try to work it out. With Russia. I mean, I just think that we lack that because I think the military is in control, but I think it's going to take somebody from the outside. I mean, I really like the idea of, somebody like Lula, the president of Brazil, who has relationships with North Korea and the United States, sitting down with them, I mean, why not?
Anybody.
Third party.
Yeah. Who's the president of Uruguay? Send that guy. I don't care.
Yeah. Anything to end this, but like our U.S. military, the pride in this, huge military we have is just, it's a sickness, and you see the repercussions all the time. Looking around at our infrastructure, our healthcare system. I mean, the country we hate, China. Look what they've done in just turning, linking all their cities through railroads, fast trains. I mean. They don't spend all of their money on military technology. They use it, to to build things inside their country. And we have so much wealth, but it goes to all this fancy military technology, deadly military technology. And I just, we know how bad the system is in terms of healthcare here, and our infrastructure is a joke.
Yeah, well, there are other things that are more important, just like on September 11th. Where's our air defenses? Well, they're all provoking this attack over the no-fly zone in southern Iraq, and they're patrolling the DMZ over in Korea.
Right.
They're not around to protect the United States of America. They're just over there getting us into fights.
Well, we had one plane in the air that day, right?
Hey, and guess what? I actually got a friend who went and was doing some research about September 11th, listening to Howard Stern talk about time to nuke the Middle East and all this stuff. And what he heard, Tim, was from an LA radio station report about, I think, an hour before September 11th, the attack commenced, was, oh, this just in, an American drone has been shot down over the no-fly zone. This is the only, aircraft of ours that was ever shot down over the no-fly zone, as far as I know, in southern Iraq. And that morning, the no-fly zone, that was the number one thing on the list, was American bases in Saudi Arabia in order to wage that air campaign against Iraq throughout the 1990s. It's the number one cause, number one motivation of the September 11th attack. And even that morning, there was news out of the no-fly zone. And by the way, as long as I'm ranting about that, I got to go ahead and mention it too, because the news just broke on this, I guess a couple of days ago. I only saw it this morning, that they finally released Bush and Cheney's interview with the 9/11 Commission. And it's just a summary, but it does have this direct quote. It says that Bush acknowledged that U.S. economic sanctions on Iraq were, quote, recruiting terrorists. Their propaganda with reports of starving Iraqi children were hurting us. So Mr. They Hate Our Freedoms admitted himself that's what it was about. It was American bases in Saudi Arabia being used to bomb and blockade the people of Iraq. And then, of course, after that, support for Israel and all the dictatorships of the Middle East, etc. But they're out of Bush's, the liar's mouth himself. They never hated us because of our virtue. It was the sins.
It's what we did. It's what we did. And the thing is, like you were saying, you don't have to love these people to listen to them, right? I mean, like Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden were saying for years, this is a terrible thing to have American military forces in Saudi Arabia, where Mecca is, right? They were like, that's what inflamed so many of those Islamic fighters, right? The U.S. and Saudi Arabia. We should have listened to that. Listen to this opposition. Just the same with North Korea. When North Korea says we're afraid you're going to attack us, they have reason to believe that that's true. And we have to try to understand why they say why they do what they do. Why are they setting off these missiles? Because they want to make sure that if there's a war, they can hit the U.S. bases that are hitting them.
Right.
Well, I mean, no country wants to be without defenses. And so, North Korea, there was a Korean War, which was largely a civil war. North Korea has never invaded another country. It so-called invaded South Korea, crossed the border into its own country. It was basically a construct. South Korea and North Korea were constructs of the Cold War. But North Korea's never invaded another country. If any Korean country has invaded another country, it's South Korea, which sent 350,000 soldiers to fight with the U.S. in South Vietnam. That was an invasion of another country. So, they have reason to think and to believe that the U.S. is a threat to them. And until the U.S. says, shows that they have some, that they don't want to do that, they'll continue to be testing, continue to build up their military, which is tragic because it's such, as you were saying, it's a military state. So much of their resources goes into military, but it's not a poor. I mean, people, a lot of Americans just write them off as just some broken third world country, but a broken third world country cannot make sophisticated missiles that could hit the United States. And a broken third world country cannot make nuclear weapons. It's just, they have a highly technical society. They've come back from all kinds of destruction to build a modern country. They're not lacking in technology, and both. There just needs to be a peace so both sides can improve their own countries. South Korea is one of the biggest military powers on earth. They're now exporting, weapons to Europe. They're exporting all kinds of weapons to Poland. Stories came out the other day. They're selling, they're selling, all kinds of military hardware to the U.S. that's being used in Ukraine. As the U.S. sends them weapons, sends Ukraine weapons, then South Korea sends them to the U.S. So the U.S. still has all these weapons too. So it just goes on and on.
Yep. All right. Well, we better leave this here.
Okay.
It's been a good one. I've missed you, Tim. Thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks a lot, Scott. I really appreciate it.
Me too, man. You guys find Tim Shorrock at patreon.com/DMZEmpire. That is his new project there. And as we forgot to discuss this time, he spent a lot of his youth over there and really has been an expert on this since I was in preschool, and I'm old. So that means he's old, but it also means he's got a hell of a lot of experience on this. So check that out again, patreon.com/DMZEmpire for Tim Shorrock's new project there.
The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.